BC, a long and bloody 27-year war has come to an end. Athens, its once dominant navy destroyed, is starved into submission at the hands of its arch-rivals, the Spartans.
The Athenian generals commanding the main Athenian fleet made a disastrous mistake that led to a great battle and a terrible defeat for the Athenians at a place called Aigospotamoi.
In the decades after Athens' demise, the city-states of Sparta and Thebes would vie for dominance of Greece. But in 359 BC, a 23-year-old from the remote northern Greek region of Macedonia became king, and within 2 decades would change the face of Greece. His name was Philip II.
Macedon was a funny Greek state. It was always a bridesmaid and never a bride. It had lots of potential, both in manpower and natural resources, but it had never managed to get its act together.
The Greeks of the city-states considered the tribal Macedonians barely civilized. Yet within 20 years, Philip had unified and transformed them into the most respected and feared military machine Greece had ever seen. Philip built Macedonia on 2 fronts, diplomacy and strength. He began by creating alliances with the surrounding city-states, while at the same time reinventing the Macedonian army, making soldiering a full-time and highly trained occupation. But the key to his new professional army was a corps of engineers that Philip organized to design and build new instruments and machines of war. An innovation that changed forever how wars would be fought and won.
The Macedonians were not considered real Greeks by the Hellenic city-states. They came from a tribe called the Macedoni, and they'd been fighting barbarians for so long that they were considered barbarians themselves. However, Philip II was no barbarian. Or if he was the most brilliant barbarian the world had ever seen. Hello, I'm Peter Weller. The pillar of Philip's military strategy was his combination of cavalry with infantry, and the pillar of his infantry was a formation called the phalanx, a rectangle group of foot soldiers that traveled very lightly at a marching speed few other armies could equal.
The phalanx had been a part of Greek warfare for hundreds of years. Now Philip would infuse it with a weapon never before seen on the battlefield.
The innovation that Philip did was changing the shape of the phalanx and introducing this long weapon called the sarissa. So the phalanx became like a huge tank.
The sarissa was a nearly 18-foot-long spear that could devastate an enemy before its soldiers could use their swords or shorter spears in a counterattack.
Basically, you plant the head of your pike against the guy and push him back. And the effect is a little bit like, you know, when a kid tries to attack him and you put your hand on the kid's forehead and his little fists are swinging like this, but they can't reach you. That's what the pike enables Philip's infantry to do.
Well-drilled, well-disciplined, and well-equipped soldiers gave the Macedonian phalanx the upper hand against traditional battle tactics. But it would be engineering technology that would ultimately make Philip's armies invincible.
For much of their military history, the Greeks were not particularly good at siegecraft. Beginning around 400 BC or shortly afterwards, the Greeks begin to take a quantum leap.
The bow and arrow had been an instrument of warfare for thousands of years, but the bow's power was limited to an individual and the strength of his arm. One of the ancient Greeks' first innovations in military engineering was in designing a bow that harnessed more power from the entire human body than from the arms alone.
The earliest weapons of siegecraft that the Greeks developed are essentially crossbows, and they're called belly shooters, gastrophetes.
You had a much bigger thing that had a kind of U-shaped element at the end that you pressed against your abdomen, and then you drew back the bow with both hands, pressing it with your torso at the same time, so you could create a much greater force of tension.
The gastrophetes was a deadly improvement over the bow and arrow, but to truly overcome the armies of the world, Philip needed more power.
In order to do even more damage, they need to come up with yet another generation of weapons. They need to invent what we might call the torsion catapult.
The torsion catapult basically creates springs by twisting sinews, or in some cases horsehair, or in emergencies even human hair. You create thick ropes of them and then twist them together.
Greek engineers designed a device that acted as a belly shooter mounted on a platform. They called it the oxybeles, or bolt shooter. Instead of using the body for power, the torsion created by the oxybeles came from twisting ropes to an explosive level of tension.
There's an enormous stored force because the sinews want to spring back and release that tension, but they're held. And inserted into this spring is a bar, and you then pull that bar back, increasing the already great tension, and then when the bars are released, they spring back with enormous force and rapidity compared to the old bow flexion system.
Distance no longer protected enemy soldiers from a sudden and bloody death. When fired, the oxybeles could pierce the shields and armor of an enemy nearly a quarter of a mile away, giving birth to a term that we still use today, catapult.
The neat thing about the word catapult is that it means skin penetrator. You can see our word pelt, like an animal skin, in the Greek catapult, goes through the skin.
With his weapons of war, Philip was unstoppable against the other Greek city-states. By 338 BC, Philip's victory over Athens and Thebes made him the undisputed master of Greece. But it was Philip's actions after the battle that would indicate how the Macedonians would rule the lands they conquered, despite their barbaric reputation.
Philip and his son Alexander, who was only 18 years old, defeat a coalition of Thebans and Athenians at the Battle of Coronea in 338 BC. And then Philip does a remarkable thing. He lets all the Athenians go back home. Then he calls together a council at Corinth, invites all of the city-states. He's got to cloak his power in some sort of diplomacy. And he tells all the city-states, you can groove. It's all going to be the same as it was before. He could have scorched the earth, just like Genghis Khan a few centuries later, but he didn't. Why? We've got to remember that the Greeks thought of the Macedonians as no better than a bunch of thugs. And the Macedonians didn't care much for the Greeks either. But Philip had had his taste of the Hellenic ideal during his time at Thebes. And as a king, he invited Greek philosophers and teachers to come to Macedonia. His entire court spoke Athenian Greek. Philip didn't want to destroy Greece. He wanted to be Greece. He was like the nerd at the back of the class who wanted to join the frat party, become one of the cool guys, albeit a little bit tougher.
In his moment of triumph, led by Macedon, he was preparing to carry out his life's ambition, which was to invade the Persian Empire.
He would never get there. Philip would meet an untimely demise at the hands of the ultimate insider. Just before Philip began his Persian conquest, he held a public celebration. As he marched alone ahead of his entourage to prove he had no one to fear, a bodyguard suddenly rushed forward and plunged a dagger into his chest. The man who had put Greece on the map was dead at 46.
Was he a lone assassin, or was there a bigger plot? We can never know for sure, because while the assassin was trying to escape, he was mowed down by Philip's guards.
Philip's dream of dominating the Persian Empire would not die with him, but only gather strength with the emergence of his son, a 20-year-old named Alexander. It was Alexander who would use Philip's army, engineers, and technology to far exceed even Philip's wildest ambitions, transforming the world into a Greek one. Marriage was a key component in Philip's diplomatic strategy. Of his 7 wives, only 1 was a Macedonian. In just 20 years, Philip II had transformed the Macedonians into a mighty army and became the absolute master of Greece. But Philip's assassination in 336 BC cut short his ultimate ambition and self-proclaimed destiny: to invade Greece's age-old enemy, Persia. Philip had conquered Greece. Now it would be up to his son to conquer the world. He was a man who became known throughout history as Alexander the Great.
Alexander was one of history's great commanders. He was absolutely brilliant on the battlefield. True enough, he inherits a great military machine, but he has to get the credit for leading this machine at a very young age.
Philip had laid the engineering groundwork for conquest. Now it was time for his son to finish the job. In 334 BC, Alexander led his Macedonian army of over 35,000 soldiers into battle against the Persian Empire. Persia was a massive superpower, dominating the lands of the Middle East and Asia Minor. Alexander and his army rampaged through what is now modern-day Turkey, carving deep inroads into Persian territory. But the Persians still had an advantage that Alexander had to neutralize if he hoped to conquer Greece's age-old enemy.
Alexander's got a problem. He doesn't have a fleet. So what he needs to do is to find a way to neutralize the Persian fleet. And his strategy is to fight the Persian navy on land by laying siege to and taking each of the great Persian naval bases.
Alexander continued to march south along the Mediterranean coast, laying siege to the cities and ports who resisted his advance. But it was the fortified and powerful city of Tyre that would provide Alexander and his engineers with their biggest challenge.
Tyre, in antiquity, was an island, a small offshore island. The city actually lay on an offshore island, and that made it relatively impregnable in the eyes of the Tyrians themselves, since they had a great fleet. All of that changed in the late 4th century.
At first, Alexander tried diplomacy. He sent messengers out to the island, urging city leaders to accept a peace treaty. The answer was short and to the point. They killed Alexander's ambassadors and threw their bodies from the top of the walls into the sea. The stakes were high. If Alexander failed to take the city, it would send a message to the world he wasn't invincible. With Tyre protected from his land forces by the sea, it was up to his engineers to bring the battlefield to the city, where Alexander could fight the Tyrians face to face. Tyre would be an island no more.
What if the enemy refused to come out and fight you? Alexander realized